You probably think Mike Israetel, Jeff Nippard, and myself are full of shit, and that science-based lifting is overrated. And you might be right. Here are 13 reasons people think science-based lifting is bullshit. Let's start with the obvious. Why would you trust me? Science-based lifters are always pencil-neck nerds. My own physique isn't that great. 6'2", only 220 pounds, and my upper body is lackluster. Likewise, Mike Israetel hasn't won any bodybuilding shows. So, who are we to say how to train? In contrast, many bro lifters are quite jacked. Sam Sulek is jacked, and he actively rejects science-based advice. Success leaves clues, right? Shouldn't you just trust a lifter whose physique is the most impressive? There's some truth to the idea. Let's do a little thought experiment. Let's assume an all-knowing being existed, and they descended from lifting paradise to meet me. They gave me a little book in which the best method to grow muscle was described. Since they were all-knowing, the methods described in this booklet were guaranteed to be the way for me to build as much muscle as humanly possible. I set out and trained using these methods for several decades. By the end of it, I had built an impressive physique. And yet, even with perfect knowledge, I hadn't built the perfect physique. I would still get beat at bodybuilding shows. Other people would still have more impressive physiques than me. See, knowledge does not scale perfectly with size. We're all playing out the genetic hand we were dealt, which no amount of knowledge can overcome entirely. We all have our own lives to deal with, which cause varying levels of stress and sleep quality. When it comes to growing muscle, everyone is not born equal. And the lifestyles we are subject to, often due to circumstances outside of our own control, all heavily impact how much muscle we can build. No amount of knowledge can overcome the uncontrollable variables. Some of us take steroids. Some of us don't. Ironically enough, steroid users, who are literally relying on pharmacology to increase their growth, are usually averse to science-based lifting. Conversely, science-based lifters are usually averse to steroid use, although there are exceptions to this. Consequently, an individual's size does not perfectly correlate with their knowledge about how to grow. If you're only going to be taking advice from the most jacked lifters, you'll end up listening to the lifters who have the best genetics and who are most open to steroid use, not the lifters who can actually help you grow. But see, for some people, science-based lifting comes off as overcomplicating things. For many, lifting is a hobby, and many are drawn to its simplicity. You go in, you lift some weights, you train hard, and you try and lift more the next time you come in. That's it. The lifters who are drawn to this simplicity will often claim things like, science-based lifters are overcomplicating everything. Just lift. Effort, consistency, and the intent to progress do account for much of the progress you can make in the gym. To be clear, that is precisely what much of the scientific research on lifting has found. Whether you do a basic bicep curl or a science-backed curl variation doesn't revolutionize your gains. These science-based tweaks will optimize your muscle growth, but the vast majority of your muscle growth does come from the basics. However, science-based lifting doesn't complicate things much. Look at the research on training volume and proximity to failure, for instance.
What it has effectively found across dozens of studies is that training with more sets and closer to failure leads to more muscle growth on average. The message here is train hard.
For range of motion, the research has essentially found focus on the stretch. Science is complicated, but science-based lifting isn't. The goal of my channel, Mike's channel, Dr. Pak's channel, and more is to distill this science into simple science-based lifting principles that you can use.
If you're happy with good results, don't worry about science-based lifting. But if you want your best muscle growth, you may need to think a little bit. If things like adding up the number of sets you do across the week or making sure you're training close to failure are too complicated for you, I'm at a loss for words.
See, lifters who reject exercise science falsely dichotomize training hard versus training smart. They view relying on science as a cop-out for lifters who just don't want to train hard. This is ironic considering the research effectively says, train hard for maximum muscle growth.
Likewise, there's no reason why you couldn't train smart and hard. Instead of taking your set of shortened partials to failure with suboptimal tempo, just pick a good exercise, focus on the stretch, use a reasonable tempo, and still go to failure.
I've seen many science-based lifters train harder than bro lifters. I've seen bro lifters train harder than science-based lifters. The false dichotomy of train hard versus train smart is based on a very small set of observations made by lifters who don't like exercise science, usually amplified by the echo chamber within which they exist. Fortunately, MyoAdapt both keeps things simple and has you training hard and smart. It uses scientific principles and individualizes training to you. You can only train a couple times a week? No problem. You want to bring up your chest? We can do that. It truly is a coach in your pocket. MyoAdapt is the smartest training app on the market, scheduled to launch in December 2024. Go to myoadapt.com now to be notified when it launches. You'll receive a free trial and lifetime discount as an early user. Some bros would even argue that none of this stuff is new. Length and partials? Sure, they seem effective based on recent research, but the GOATs have been doing them for decades. Ronnie did almost all of his pressing and rowing as length and partials, and he was jacked. Nothing new. Next. Except no, that's a very bad way of looking at science. For virtually any training style, you can find someone who has done it and had a decent physique. There's only so many ways to train out there, and there are millions of lifters out there. Just running the numbers, someone with a great physique will have done low volume. Someone will have done high volume. Someone will have done some length and partials. Someone will have done some shortened partials. Claiming we've known this for decades is reminiscent of accusing science-based lifters of cherry-picking studies or data to fit their narrative. For nearly any new training style, you can find a lifter that incorporated it and was jacked. One issue with this appeal to successful lifters is that the successful lifters in question frequently incorporated a laundry list of different strategies.
I mentioned Ronnie did length and partials on pressing and rowing, but he also did shortened partials on the squat, for example. He did full range of motion on other exercises. Can we really use Ronnie's insane physique as evidence for length and partials if he also did other stuff alongside it?
Cherry picking gets you in trouble, whether it's in the bro science aisle or in the exercise science aisle of lifting. Science skeptics will often say, for every study you cite, I can find one claiming the opposite. There can be some truth to this. In a new area of research, you often only have a couple of studies to rely on.
A good science-based lifter will recognize this and refrain from holding a strong stance. Your beliefs on a training strategy should be proportional to the amount of evidence to support it. However, in many areas, we have enough studies for this to be a fallacy. Let's take volume as an example.
We have a few dozen studies looking at the effects of training volume on muscle growth. Most studies find more muscle growth from more volume. If I cited a study showing this, as most do, you could probably find and cherry-pick a study that found no benefit of higher volumes for muscle growth. But that's ignoring what the majority of the studies say. In fact, if we simply went tit for tat, you'd run out of ammunition long before I did. The tit-for-tat approach isn't the best way to good research though. This is referred to as box counting, just like you'd do during a presidential election. Instead, a meta-analysis, which mathematically combines the results of many small studies, allows you to account for how strong individual studies really are. A study with a huge sample size, for example, is going to be a much stronger piece of evidence than a study with a tiny sample size. Meta-analyses account for this in their methods. When a new study gets published, you'll often see bros exclaiming, "This is only one study. I'll wait for a replication."
I applaud you for knowing what a replication study even is. In case you're not up to speed, a replication study is when you take an existing study, usually when the results are controversial or important to the field, and repeat the exact same study with the same methods. You'll usually aim to get a larger number of participants so you can have greater faith in the results.
Basically, the thinking goes that once can be a fluke, but twice is a pattern.
Replication studies are important, especially in fields like exercise science. Believe it or not, we're not living the rock star life. We're not throwing money around to find out which bicep exercise builds the biggest guns. We're always scrounging for funding, and we often go unpaid for doing these studies as a labor of love.
As a result, we're usually unable to get a big enough sample size to make a single study big enough to be accurate. If you only get a dozen or 2 dozen participants in a study, you can see muscle growth patterns that aren't the result of one training approach being better than the other, but rather could be a result of one group's participants simply having better genetics, for example. We need several studies to have similar results. before we can confidently start saying something works or doesn't work. However, the critique of this is only one study, it needs to be replicated, is sometimes even leveled at meta-studies, like meta-analyses or systematic reviews. These studies can still go wrong. There are subjective decisions in how a meta-analysis is performed. Systematic reviews involve interpretation by the human researchers. But while these are single studies, they are predicated on the results of dozens of studies, typically. Their conclusions are much more robust than your usual single experimental study. When bros respond this to a meta-analysis or a systematic review, it's usually because they haven't even read the title or the abstract. If they did, they'd realize this isn't an experimental study, but a synthesis of dozens of experimental studies. When faced with conflicting headlines in a short time span, even a well-intentioned viewer might get the idea that the science keeps flip-flopping. One week, science says this, the next it says the opposite. A good science communicator will make it clear that a single study does not change how you should train. Again, unless it is a well-conducted meta-analysis or a systematic review. In Bayesian terms, all it should do is shift your opinion based on how strong this new piece of evidence is compared to what your prior beliefs were based on. Some science communicators don't do a great job of this, but if you remember to view new evidence in light of prior evidence and adjust accordingly, you'll never make this mistake again. Alternatively, bros will disregard a study because the participants in the study didn't even lift.
There's a kernel of truth here. When it comes to informing your training, ideally, the study would be as specific and ecologically valid as possible. The participants would ideally be similar to you. The training performed in this study would ideally be something you would do. The more of a match there is, the more likely the results are to apply to you.
And yet, many lifters assume that they are special little snowflakes. There's two issues with this. For one, many effects do still generalize between more well-trained and less well-trained lifters. Yes, there are likely some differences between someone who's been training for a longer time and someone who started lifting recently. But even the relationship between volume and hypertrophy doesn't seem different in less well-trained lifters and more well-trained lifters. Unless you have a compelling physiological reason to expect a relationship not to generalize to you, if we have plenty of research on a topic, the results probably do apply to you too. But, you might retort, I bet the participants in this study didn't actually train to failure. I train way harder, bro, 100%. While we can engage in a measuring contest all you want, let's instead look at a few objective facts. When comparing you, on your own, in the gym, trying to take a set to failure, to a participant in a lab trying to train to failure, the participant has way bigger incentives to actually achieve failure. Yes, you are very hardcore and serious about our little hobby of lifting weights. As am I. I'm sure you train hard and do your best. But in a lab, that is also the case. The participant also does their best. Not only that, they usually often have several researchers like myself yelling at them to keep pushing the set. Having someone watch you, let alone yelling at you, does help. Likewise, participants often receive an incentive to participate in studies and complete it properly, such as a few $100 of gift vouchers upon completion. They have a financial incentive to push themselves as well. Finally, participants usually form friendships with researchers over the course of a training study. The last thing you want to do is disappoint a friend by not taking the training protocol seriously. Sure, you can argue that the people willing to take part in studies are, on average, slightly less serious about lifting than you might be, since they're willing to hand over the reins on their training. However, based on the facts I just mentioned, and my own experience conducting scientific research in the lab, I'd say the average participant trains harder in a study than the average lifter does in the gym. The idea that you're a special little snowflake is also sometimes used to point out that science-based lifting relies on averages. Since everyone is a little different, this is a flawed approach, right?
Not quite. For biological characteristics, like how someone's body responds to a training program, we generally assume that people's responses can be described via normal distribution. A normal distribution implies that most people will have a pretty average response. By the nature of normal distributions, most people are actually pretty average in how they respond to higher volume training, for example.
That's not to say you should never individualize your training, but even in the research, we still don't really know whether people respond all that differently to different training styles. Sure, some people grow more than others, but is that because they're following the right training style for them, or just because they would grow more regardless of what they did? We don't quite know yet.
For the time being, the reasonable assumption to make is to assume you are close to the average. Probabilistically, it is likely.
But instead of doubting the role of exercise science in informing your practice, you can also take issue with the researchers themselves. Take my good friend and colleague Brad Shenfeld, for example. Brad's been doing exercise science research for several decades at this point. He's always been very cautious in expressing his stances, and yet he's perpetually faced backlash. Back in 2019, he set out to replicate a study that had been making the rounds and causing controversy. A few years prior, a group of researchers in Brazil compared the muscle growth of 3 groups of participants. The 1-set group performed a single set on all exercises. The 3-set group performed 3 sets on all exercises. Finally, the 5-set group performed 5 sets for all exercises. This study compared extreme volumes, up to 45 sets per week for the triceps in the 5-set group, to more moderate volumes in the ballpark of 10 to 20 sets. At the time, the prevailing thinking within the fitness industry held that more volume led to more growth, but that the benefit was capped at around 10 to 15 sets per week at the most.
Naturally, people expected the 3-set group to come out ahead, and yet that's not what happened. The biceps and triceps grew most when doing 30 to 45 weekly sets, insanely high volumes by all accounts.
As you'd expect, this took the industry by storm. A few years later, Brad himself set out to replicate the study. He conducted a very similar study to see whether the study by Radeli and colleagues hadn't just been a fluke.
Lo and behold, Brad's study effectively found the same thing. Muscle growth was generally greatest in the 5-set group compared to the 3-set group and 1-set group, in the biceps, triceps, and quads.
People were already skeptical of Radeli's findings. When Brad conducted a replication study and found similar results, reasonable people grew more amenable to the idea that higher volumes could cause more muscle growth. But a small contingent of people still refused to believe that was the case. Instead, they accused Brad of bias. Surely Brad had done something to mess these results up intentionally, right? A few years later, with the benefit of hindsight, it seems clear that higher volumes do lead to more muscle growth. In fact, the most recent meta-analysis shows exactly what both the study by Radeli and colleagues and Shenfeld and colleagues had found. More muscle growth with more volume, all the way to 30 plus sets per week. But for some people, when Brad's study was published, it was much more tempting to accuse the researchers of bias than to adjust their prior beliefs. Don't get me wrong, instances of bias due to financial interests, for example, do exist. They sometimes occur in supplement research, for example. But they're much rarer than you might think in exercise science. Believe it or not, there is no big volume lobby or a long muscle length cartel. I don't sell anything in relation to these things. If the evidence changes, I'll simply change what I say. We simply present what the evidence says to the best of our ability. Another common critique of science-based lifting is that exercise science studies suck. Bias is insidious, and it can be conscious or unconscious. However, there are steps we take in the research to minimize bias too. Let me use the example of our most recent range of motion study. There are 3 things we did to minimize bias. First, pre-registration. Before we ever had participants set foot in the lab, we described our methods clearly. This prevents us from changing the methods after the fact, without good justification, to rig the results. Let's say we hadn't pre-registered our study. For argument's sake, let's say we found that 15 of our participants responded much better to lengthened partials. We could have only published the data in those 15 participants, and no one would have ever known the rest of our participants actually responded better to a full range of motion. Likewise, we could have posited a hypothesis after the results were known that full range of motion and lengthened partials would lead to the same muscle growth, guaranteeing a 100% success rate for hypotheses. A pre-registration mitigates this risk, since the reader and the peer reviewer can see whether we followed through on our publicly stated methods up front. Any changes from the initial methods need to be justified clearly. Second, blinding. Both the ultrasound technician, who assessed muscle growth from full range of motion versus lengthened partials, and the statistician, who conducted the formal statistical analysis, were blinded. Brad never stepped foot in the lab when participants were training. He also never had access to the sheet to see which arm was the full range of motion arm or the lengthened partial arm. So, when Brad measured the thickness of the arms, he was doing so without knowledge of condition. Even if he was biased and wanted to have lengthened partials come out ahead, he couldn't make it happen. The same goes for a statistician, Paul. When we sent him the data to analyze, we labeled the conditions as 1 and 2. He performed the analysis. Once we received the results from him, only then did we reveal that 1 was lengthened partials and 2 was full range of motion. So, even if he was biased during analysis and wanted to have lengthened partials come out ahead, he couldn't make it happen. These are only 3 examples of how researchers aim to minimize potential bias. There are many more strategies under the umbrella of the open science movement, like sharing your data for others to look at, sharing your data analysis code, and more. Hell, we even made videos of participants training publicly available so you could have a bit more faith in the methods being used. Things aren't perfect yet, but things are getting better all the time. Science is just a marketing gimmick. We don't need science to tell us how to lift. I'm sympathetic to this critique. Making videos on science-based lifting shares parallels with journalism. New research type content does well, just like the infamous scoop concept in journalism. Likewise, since there's a skill element to conducting, interpreting, and communicating new research, you're setting yourself apart from many other fitness influencers who may not be as good at this as you are. This does benefit science-based influencers, but that is just the business side of things, not the mark you're ultimately leaving on the world. Science is not just a marketing gimmick. I'm not going to try to convince you of that in this video, but science is the best way to inch closer to the truth. That includes the truth of how to best work out to build muscle. From a moral consequentialist perspective, the communication of science is a good thing, provided it is carried out with the appropriate nuance and gravitas. If you zoom out, part of the role of science-based content is to get people interested in exercise science, science more broadly, and even thinking scientifically and critically about other things in their lives. No, this new study on lengthened partials probably doesn't matter all that much. But if I can get you to care about this new study and click on the video through a good title and thumbnail, and you leave the video with a better understanding of lifting and how to think, my job here is done. The only thing I still need to impart upon you is that Rascal Apparel should be your go-to gym clothing brand. rascalapparel.com, code WOLF at checkout for 10% off.